Claire Duquesnoy, who's an assistant professor of economics at the University of Pittsburgh.
Thank
Claire?
you, thank you. I hope everybody slept well last night, because that's what we're going to talk about. This is a paper I'm working on with Maulik Jagnani at the University of Colorado, and we're going to be talking about sleep quality and its connection to financial conditions. This project is really motivated by some evidence that comes out of the sleep science literature. So if you want to bring some more people to this convention in the future, invite some sleep scientists, because I think they might have some interesting thoughts on these issues. So we know from that literature there's substantial evidence that sleep's an important input for attention, things like memory and cognition. And then there's a pretty big descriptive literature also that has looked at how poverty is correlated with poor sleep quality, including work done by people in this room as well. And there's a number of different reasons for that. You can think of poor environmental conditions, so things like noise, heat, bugs, physical discomfort, so hunger, pain, illness, and I should take this one off. And then, of course, what we're going to be focusing on, which is psychological factors, and so issues, things like worry, rumination, problem solving, and basically experiencing these kind of intrusive patterns of thinking that maintain your mind kind of cognitively aroused when you're trying to sleep. And so there's kind of this separate literature in the sleep sciences that has looked at and asked people about what they're experiencing when they're experiencing sleeplessness, and these are the kinds of things that people talk about. And so what we're going to be asking with this project is, do these psychological factors, can they themselves be induced by poverty and thus have a direct causal impact on people's sleep quality? And if that's the case, then could sleep be one of the mechanisms that kind of causally links poverty to those cognitive effects that have been identified in some of that literature? So what we're going to be doing with this project is we're going to be investigating this with a regression discontinuity design around the date of an unconditional cash transfer program in Indonesia. And we're going to find patterns of increased sleep quality, not quantity, and impacts on cognition as well for transfer receiving household heads, with no real impacts on kind of other household members or non-receiving households. And so this connects to a few different literatures in economics. There is a literature on sleep in economics. There's most of it coming from the developed context. There's a few papers in the developing context, but really not a whole lot. And so this is not something that we know a whole lot about, is how people are sleeping in the developing world. And so I think there's a lot of space for work in that area. And then, and most of this literature, oftentimes you're going to look at differences in sleep quantity often, not always, but quantity often, and then look at impacts on things like productivity, education, and health. And we're kind of flipping that a little bit and thinking about what happens when you have poverty, how does that actually impact sleep itself? And so we feel that this is also a contribution to the literature on poverty and cognition. Obviously, there's a lot more papers in that space than what I'm citing here, but in a way to think about, what could be one of the things that's explaining some of these effects. Not all of them and not all of the mechanisms that are studied in that literature, but one possible channel. And then, of course, since we're going to be looking at cash transfers, we've seen a bunch of different papers on cash transfers. So again, this is not an extensive lit review here, but I think this is important for the literature on cash transfers and well-being as well. So the data that we're working with, we're going to be working with the data from the Indonesian Family Life Survey, the fifth wave specifically. For those of you who aren't familiar with this data, this is a very extensive household survey that's part of a long-running panel that goes all the way back to 1993, and that just covers a large number of households and individuals. And so we're going to be working with the fifth wave specifically. Because in the fifth wave, they introduced a sleep questionnaire, not just a sleep questionnaire, but a sleep quality questionnaire, which is quite unusual. And so They have basically a questionnaire that covers 10 different questions that are designed to measure sleep disturbance and sleep-related impairment. And so you should be thinking about questions such as, I experienced difficulty falling asleep last night, rated on a scale of 1 to 5, pretty much. Or questions like, I felt irritable because I didn't sleep well last night. So questions that are really getting at sleep quality specifically. And then in addition, the IFLS-5 is just a wonderfully rich household survey, and they have a bunch of different cognitive measures that we're going to explore, as well as a wealth of other kind of household survey type stuff, income, and so forth. We also are able to observe whether or not the household receives government transfers, or at least reports receiving them. We're also going to pull in a few cognitive measures from previous waves of the survey, though it's not quite as rich what was included in the fourth wave, so we'll be a little bit limited there. So the transfer that we're going to be looking at is Indonesia's BLSM transfers. And so these are unconditional cash transfers that are disbursed to poor and near poor households when the government changes fuel subsidies, basically. And so these have happened kind of intermittently every so often since 2005 about. And whenever the government modifies their subsidized price for gasoline or for fuels, they will often disburse a transfer to a large share of households simultaneously, kind of. And so these transfers are disbursed using a system of kind of social insurance protection cards that are kind of allocated using a Proximine test to households, and we can observe in the data whether households report having one of these cards. And so the transfer that we're going to focus on specifically is the one that happened in November 2014. And so what happened in November 2014 is on the 18th of November, the new government basically announced that they were going to be cutting fuel subsidies, and the price of gasoline went up by about 30%. The macroeconomic consequences for this particular subsidy cut were not super substantial. It's not estimated that they really impacted economic growth, and it was tied to a little bit higher inflation, but this is a context where inflation rates were already kind of in the 7% area. So some inflation, but not as much as in some of the previous cuts. The transfer itself ended up being, we're talking about $30 US, so it's not massive, but it's pretty substantial for these households. And so in our data, we're looking at this amount representing about 30% of a receiving household's kind of median monthly food expenditures. So it's kind of like enough to like soften, the round out the end of the month, but we're not talking about life-changing amounts like have been studied in some other contexts. Conveniently for us, this particular transfer coincided with the rollout of the IFLS-5 survey. And so as the survey team was basically surveying the fifth wave of data, you have the transfer ends up happening basically in week 47 of 2014. And so we're going to be working with data that surrounds that week and that I've highlighted in yellow here. And so basically we're going to be comparing kind of what we're seeing in households right before the transfer gets rolled out to what we're seeing in households right afterwards. And so the rollout itself happened quite rapidly, and we can actually see the transfer showing up in the IFLS survey. And so if I look at households that report having a social protection card, within basically a couple weeks of this shock and these transfers going out, you start to see immediately households reporting some households reporting that they're receiving this transfer, and rapidly, basically within 2 weeks, you reach a level of about 50% of these card-holding households reporting that they've received this November transfer. And so who we're going to be focusing on? We're going to be focusing on these BLSM cardholders. So these are households that report having one of these social protection cards. I won't go through all the acronyms, but they report having one of these social protection cards, which is a strong predictor for being eligible for receiving this transfer. And so we're going to look at what's happening in households that have these cards and contrast that to households that don't have these cards. And then we're also going to be focusing on household heads, because we kind of want to focus on the person in the household who we think is most likely to be worried about the household finances and what's going on with the income in the household. And this is the household head is the person who the household itself designates when the surveyors approach as the person among the group of householders who is responsible for satisfying daily necessities of the household, or a person who's kind of regarded or assigned as the household head. So we're going to look at what happens with household heads as well as other household members too. So the specification, super straightforward regression discontinuity design, and we're going to be interested in basically this beta 1 coefficient is mostly what I'm going to be reporting, which is kind of what's happening at that threshold kind of right before the transfer compared to right after the transfer. Now what you have to believe is that the households that happen to be surveyed right before and right after are, it's pretty much random whether you were surveyed right before or after, and we check for balance and things look quite good. So the main results look like this. This figure down here basically kind of tells the whole story. If we look at how household heads report sleeping, the level of sleep impairment specifically that they experience prior to the transfer, you see that in card-holding households, so lower income, the poorer households in our data, that household head is reporting higher levels of sleep impairment than non-card-holding households. And then right after the transfer, you see a bit of a flip where for a few weeks at least, those the lower income households are actually reporting better sleep, and then eventually things kind of are going back to the pattern that you saw before. And so you see this big discontinuity amongst the card-holding households, and you just don't really see anything amongst the untreated households, which is what you would expect. That effect is robust to a bunch of different specifications, quadratic specifications, inclusions, exclusions of fixed effects. And we're talking about, these are in standard deviations, so basically the reported sleep impairment that the household heads are experiencing is dropping by about 0.3 standard deviations. Now that's the reduced form effect, since about half of the households are actually getting the transfer in our data. You would scale it and basically double that about. The effect really seems to be concentrated amongst household heads. So when we look at non-heads of households, we're really not seeing anything happening there. But when we look at household heads, no matter what their demographic characteristics, they all seem to be experiencing something similar. And so most of the household heads are kind of middle-aged men, but we do have some female heads of households, and we're underpowered there because there's not as many, but we're seeing very similar magnitude of effects for the female household heads. We see kind of similar effects across the different age groups, with the exception of the much older household heads, but that's a very small share of the household heads. In terms of cognitive impacts, so we're looking basically again for a discontinuity in our measures of cognition. We're not seeing a whole lot going on the Ravens scores. The Ravens matrices in the IFLS-5 though are pretty crude. There's only like eight matrices that are presented to them, and they're a bit top censored. The math question, we see something when we control for previous performance, but this is again a very small sample, so I'm not going to kind of hang my hat on that particular effect. Where we do really seem to be seeing stuff is on memory, and so this is a word recall exercise where the respondents are asked to remember a set of 10 words immediately after being listed them, and then like 10 minutes later. And so we seem to be seeing something on memory where the household heads are performing better on this memory task when they're interviewed after the transfer. And I don't have the results here, but we did start to look at heterogeneity just before kind of coming out here. And when we look at the poorest household heads, you actually do seem to maybe get some action on some of these other cognitive measures as well amongst the poorest group. But those are kind of preliminary results, so I'm not going to get into them too much. We really don't see anything going on the household head performance for kind of non-card holding household heads, since they're not being treated. And for other household members that are not the heads of households, it basically, if there is any effect, it's much smaller and not significant, statistically speaking. We look at for a bunch of different things that could be going on. So we look at sleep timing. We're not seeing any changes in sleep timing or quantity. We don't really see any changes in reported amount of work time. We don't see changes in kind of reports of nutrition or kind of eating patterns for the week prior to the survey, or in depression and affect questions. And so we really see this as kind of a signal of worries that are affecting household heads. And so where we want to go with this next is we really want to try and disentangle this and see how much of some of those cognitive effects that we're seeing in the literature could be coming from a sleep mechanism and these intrusive and distracting thoughts that people are talking about. Is it happening when you're taking the test, or is it happening the night before when you're sleeping, right? And so we're going to be piloting basically a pretty straightforward 2x2 intervention on Prolific, where we're going to be surveying people in the evening and the following morning, and have a treatment that's kind of designed to get them to think about their financial concerns, right, shortly before bed, and then before taking the test, and trying to disentangle those effects. And then collect the relevant data. So, yeah. So, just to conclude, providing some of the first causal evidence of the impacts on financial weary conditions and sleep quality. And I think we're all ready for the refreshments now. So.
We have time for a few questions for Claire, if anybody has any.
I haven't actually left the survey itself. Yeah. So who took the survey? It wasn't always the household head.
They survey like who answers the questions.
Yeah, because then you said you had data for non-household head.
Oh,
like
they survey like
members
lots
the
of people in the household.
Okay.
Right. So like the IFLS 5 is a wonderful health survey where we check blood pressure, we check they survey pretty much like all of the household members.
Okay, so I'm not reporting for my spouse.
No, I don't. So I don't. Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah.
Do you see the other changes and other things you would expect to change with sleep quality? Like you said, there was no change in depression or affect.
No.
And I thought maybe there might be a change in depression or affect.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't see anything on depression or affect. It's a pretty temporary thing, right? And so if you think about some of the depression measures, my sense is it's perhaps not all that surprising, because the effects that we're seeing, they're lasting like 3 weeks. This isn't a massive transfer, right? So we're not talking about life-changing amounts of money here. We're talking about something that would kind of help you, round out the end of the month and alleviate some financial constraint. That's what the transfer is designed to do, is to help insulate households from any kind of price effects that the gas subsidy could create. And so I think the one that we did check, so the CESD, the depression measures, they do have a question about sleep. And so we did look at that question specifically. We don't actually pick anything up on that question, which is kind of interesting. And there are like some other questions throughout the survey that ask a little bit about, sleep and tiredness related issues. And it's really on this particular questionnaire where you really got the people thinking about the quality of the sleep that you start to see all of these effects becoming kind of significant. And so this particular questionnaire, I think, is just very well designed, and I've checked, it's a very validated kind of sleep quality index for picking up kind of changes in sleep quality. Yeah.
Struck that sleep quality is becoming so, as you're suggesting, and sleep in general is becoming such an important area. And I think we're undergoing in the U.S., a big sort of cultural change where people are coming to realize that sleep matters. And so I think this is bound to make a difference. I mean, growing up in a time where, well, okay, I'll sleep when I'm dead. You know what I mean? This idea that it didn't really matter. You could
Yeah.
just keep doing things. But now it's like the sleep is washing your brain, all the stuff that's in the popular press. So it'll be
Yep.
interesting to see what happens as that becomes more a culturally prevalent idea.
I agree, and I don't think it's exclusive to sleep. I think it's just this interest in people's well-being, and sleep is being recognized as being a pretty important component of that. Yeah,
I think it's super important. Thanks.
yeah.
I was just thinking, so the whole paper is about night sleep. There's a lot of, like, my understanding is that there's a lot of study now on studying the napping time
Yeah.
that you have during the day.
Yep.
What is your, I mean, I don't have any information or prior about that, but like in developing country or versus developed country, we know that in some culture, napping is an important time, and power nap is getting popular in the media. I'm not sure Americans are really good at it right now, but so what is your sense of this, and how do you think it affects, or it would affect your outcome?
I mean, I think that the difference between daytime, if you go to countries that aren't the U.S., like napping is so common and so important, and we know from other work that napping is very important for productivity. In terms of this particular result, we're very much focused on nighttime sleep, and I don't think we observe any kind of daytime sleep patterns in our data. I don't think it's something that's asked in the survey. I will double, triple check, but I'm pretty sure I would have liked it at this point. And so, we can't really disentangle that or look for kind of any kind of heterogeneity that would be related to napping. So this is really just like a difference in the pattern that we see for nighttime sleep specifically. And when we look at the different questions that are asked on the PROMIS question, all of them kind of seem to be affected. And so, since there's some questions, these are basically the kinds of questions that are being asked, and we see effects across the board, kind of, on these different questions about sleep quality.
I was just wondering if they did a time survey, because it would be interesting to see if.
It's a very crude. So they don't have a full-on time survey in the IFLS 5. What they do have is in like the labor questionnaire, they have a question of how many hours you worked. So we can check that. And then at different points in the health questionnaire, they ask people when they wake up and when they went to bed yesterday. And so we check that, and we don't really see any movement in terms of the quantity. And so the quantity is not really, doesn't seem to be what's moving here. It's really about quality and like sleep effectiveness, which I think is very interesting, because you've committed this amount of time to sleep activities, and so if you're not using that time efficiently because of these financial kind of concerns, I think that's what we're picking up.
No, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. But like even the quality could change, right? Like
Yeah, no, that's
I'm
right.
more rested now. I'm gonna exercise or something.
Yeah,
right?
and so we don't, unfortunately, that's why part of the reason why we wanted to check work is if this is an agriculture context and work is kind of heavier labor, and we're not seeing any changes in work time, but that's all. I don't think, I can double check, I don't think there's much other information about like physical activity in this particular survey. Yeah. But you would have to think of something that would be happening like that could be induced by this $30 transfer. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not.
Yeah.
It's not a
No, I know,
think
it's
sort of
interesting.
Like, it's interesting that
Yeah.
there may be other effects.
Yeah. And so, we're this is pretty new, so we're going to be hoping to look at some more heterogeneity and effects, and like, could the environment that you're sleeping in have an interactive effect with this? Because you can come up with some interesting stories where, I wake up because of it's hot or there's a noise or something, and then now that I'm awake, I'm not sleeping, I'm not able to get back. So there's some more stuff that we're planning to do with that. Yeah, and that kind of heterogeneity would be interesting too. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much, Claire. So I think we're just going to have some short wrap-up remarks.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I was, of course, I had prepared some amazing transformational concluding remarks.
Here,
but,
Mahesh.
you just are not going to be able to
Mahesh.
hear that right now.
So I know I don't want to stand in between everybody in the hors d'oeuvres and refreshments, but I did want to thank all of you very much for coming, for your amazing engagement. Thanks to all of the speakers. It was really thought-provoking. I wanted to thank absolutely Christina and Yerong and all of the SIGA staff for doing an amazing job of just putting on this event. And people have told me that they have felt cared for at this event. So that is really great. So yeah, why don't we go on outside and continue?
Say goodbye to everybody on Zoom. Thanks for joining remotely, and we'll be putting up recordings of presentations on the event webpage. So thanks again to everybody.